All right, let's begin part 15, the recursive radicalism of Nick Fuentes. We're going to begin with the burning threshold. I'm going to do this reading without music, see if my cadence comes off better. I feel like maybe the sound has been interrupting how I hear my own voice. So the burning threshold, impatience, catastrophe, and the sovereign who arrives too late. Impatience is the final virtue of disillusioned. Impatience is the final virtue of the disillusioned. Every empire falls first within its own expectations. Moderation becomes treason when the house is already burning. The unreasonable rebel. The unreasonable rebel emerges only when the horizon of patience collapses. For he is the one who refuses to barter urgency for reassurance, insisting that a system is free fall, cannot be mended with symbolic stitches. Impatience becomes revolutionary not because it is loud, but because it refuses to be consoled. It sees delay as complicity, incrementalism as anesthetic, and postponement as betrayal disguised as prudence. The figure who says burn it down speaks less of flames than of thresholds, of the moment beyond which restoration ceases to be possible and only transformation remains. In every political cosmology, there is a rite in which the disciple becomes the heretic. It is the moment he realizes that the reasonable center is simply the voice of power recruiting him into slow suicide. The rebel believes that systems respond only to shocks, that equilibrium is merely frozen inertia, that the engine of change is ignited by those who refuse to wait another decade for promises already broken. He sees the establishment's incremental gifts, small statistics, selective wins, procedural victories, not as progress, but as sedatives designed to keep the dissident from noticing the widening chasm underneath. The unreasonable stance is not recklessness, but clarity, a recognition that the house is already ablaze, and moderation has become a ritual of pretending the smoke is incense. The rebel's fury is not directed at opponents alone, but the allies who apologize for their own powerlessness while asking him to trust a machine already rusted by compromise. Every renewal begins with a refusal to accept the false binary between slow decline and managed decay. Patience can be a mask for fear, and fear can be sold as prudence. The rebel unmasks both. When a citizen proclaims, "We will burn it down," the flame he invokes is symbolic, a metaphor for the cleansing demand when institutions no longer respond to the living pulse of the populace. The true danger is not incendiary, but the population that begins to agree with him. The reasonable defender, the defender of continuity, the keeper of thresholds. The reasonable defender does not deny decay. He denies the illusion that destruction has no cost. He speaks from the vantage of memory, knowing that revolutions promise purity, but often deliver ashes. He fears that in burning the house, one also burns the roof under which the future reform might have been possible. He cautions that the lesser catastrophe is still preferable to the greater one, that while the ship is weathered, scuttling in mid-sea, ensures all aboard will drown before land is sighted. His refrain is, "It is better than the alternative," is not an apology for mediocrity, but a recognition that some futures are anonymously worse. He insists that continuity, even damaged continuity, is a source not easily rebuilt, that legitimacy, once collapsed, seldom returns intact. The defender fears that the fire spreads faster than intentions, that symbolic burning becomes literal burning, that the rebel's metaphor becomes the crowd's conflagration. His worldview centers around thresholds, a line beyond which destruction outpaces the speed at which new structures can be erected. He knows that radical solutions often produce counter-radical reactions and that the pendulum of history rarely swings with precision. Stability is not cowardice, he argues, but infrastructure, the hidden lattice through which society breathes. When he asks better than what, he is not rejecting urgency, he is demanding a blueprint instead of a bonfire. His great fear is not the rebels' anger, but the vacuum created after the rebels' victory, when new power rises unrestrained by the old mechanisms he sought to destroy. He understands that the sovereign who inherits chaos must rule with force, and that those who demand the fire may recoil from the cost of its aftermath. The fractured reality, statistics, mistrust, the war over what is real. In an empire of conflicting narratives, data becomes a weapon and statistics become trench lines, each side declaring the other's numbers fabricated, biased, or conjured from the fog of bureaucracy. A population that no longer trusts its count cannot trust its country. Mistrust in numbers becomes mistrust in neighbors, and mistrust in neighbors becomes a politics of existential suspicion. The argument over 2 million or not is not about figures, it is about reality itself, about who gets to name the conditions of the nation. When the institution meant to measure truth lost credibility, political factions erect their own epistemologies, each with its own prophets, heretics, and holy ledgers. Truth becomes procedural, real not because it is accurate, but because it is repeated by a trusted voice. Every civilization develops a reality index, the shared assumption that makes discourse possible. When the index fractures, persuasion dies and only tribal allegiances remain. A debate over numbers is rarely about numbers, it is a referendum on loyalty. The sovereign who cannot fix the reality index loses authority even when he speaks the truth. Statistics disputes become metaphysical. What is happening becomes what we are allowed to say is happening. Citizens do not rebel when conditions worsen. They rebel when official descriptions of conditions diverge visibly from lived experience. A government that gaslights its own population teaches them to treat every fact as propaganda and every statistic as a psyop. Once the reality index collapses, the next sovereign must rebuild not only infrastructure but meaning itself. The partisan demo and the archetype of the enemy, left versus right, as mythic combat rather than policy disagreement. Each faction imagines the other not as misguided but as possessed. Ideological opponents become avatars of decay, corruption, and inversion. When a movement declares its rivals anti-nation, it does not merely disagree with them, it excommunicates them from the symbolic body of the polity. The left becomes in the right's cosmology a force of entropy. The right becomes in the left's cosmology a force of regression. Each misunderstands the other, yet both myths generate real consequences. Partisan animus transform persons into personifications, not individuals, but embodiments of what must be resisted. When both factions believe the other hates the nation, compromise becomes betrayal and consolation becomes treason. Demonology replaces debate. Opponents are not wrong but damned, not misguided but malicious. Ideological absolutism flourishes when political cosmologies no longer overlap. The rhetoric of burn it down becomes contagious once each side believes the other already has. When the nation becomes a battlefield for moral archetypes, policy proposals are interpreted as omens, not plans. The desire for purity eclipses the desire for governance. The fight becomes ends, means, and justifications. In each climate, even the moderate becomes radicalized, if not in position, then in self-defense. The myth of existential threat becomes self-fulfilling as institutions fracture under the pressure of competing realities. The greater danger is not that each side thinks the other is wrong, it is that each side thinks the other is irredeemable. A polity that loses the ability to distinguish opposition from enemy has already entered its pre-collapse phase. All right, that's the end of part 15. I'm going to get off of here. No one's watching. I'll see you guys later.